Welcome, everyone, back to another episode, another rendition of the 706 podcast, starring the amicable, beautiful, intelligent, and perspicacious individuals that I have with me today. Tony, Anthony, and Connor. Why don't you say hi to the audience in that order?
Hi, guys. This is Tony.
Anthony.
I am not a spaghetti man. Which movie was that? Does anyone remember?
Is it a Coen Brothers film?
No, it's something we watched for this podcast. It was A Woman Under the Influence. I was just flashing back to that.
I totally forgot that.
There we go. See, we're so far removed from our initial beginnings. I mean, we've come so far. This, I think, is an episode that might be in the late 70s in terms of chronology.
No, we're in the mid 80s at this point.
Okay, we're into the 80s. All right, we're in our 8th decade here, and it's very fun, and we're, of course, honored and humbled to have you join us as we discuss a prolific film. Really, I mean, sometimes we look at the niche and we look at the hidden gems, but this time we have a Hallmark film. It's not literally a Hallmark film, but it's No Country for Old Men, kind of a thriller, drama, mishmash genres, actually, some Western elements. I think it's 2007, I want to say. I had that in front of me, but I have the memory of the goldfish. Yes, November 21st, 2007. It's a Coen Brothers film. So, you know, Coen Brothers, very much a player in the last 30 years of cinema. They always have a unique perspective to offer, for better or worse. I know some folks, even on our podcast, can kind of shy away from some of their films. Maybe like, what is the one? Hail Caesar recently. I think we had some mixed reactions. But this one is, I would say, a banner film. You know, you could put it right up there with Fargo. It did win Best Picture. It's a film about kind of a drug deal gone bad in Western Texas, very remote, desolate area, deserty, kind of bordering or adjacent to Mexico. So there's some kind of seeping influence there in, you know, back and forth. And so a drug deal gone bad between, I guess, some Mexican dope runners and some buyers in America. Everybody gets killed. And this kind of third party, Josh Brolin, Llewellyn Moss, finds the $2 million that would have been used to buy the dope. And he attempts to run away with it. Now, the buyers, or the prospective buyers, hire a hitman, Anton Chigurh, who is played by Javier Bardem, to go acquire and retrieve the funds from Llewellyn, who, you know, is trying to elude Chigurh. And then there's even another bounty hunter involved. And so it's, and then also the third main character is Tommy Lee Jones. Yes, he's an aging sheriff in kind of this very downtrodden county in Western Texas, very kind of old school, clutching at pearls. And he's coming to terms with all of this as it's happening. This is like happening in the late 80s, or I think it's 1980 is the year. Anyways, the plot unfolds from there, but we'll kind of naturally get into what happens as we discuss the film. So let's see. Who would I like to start with? I think everybody's seen it. I want to go with Anthony first, because if I remember correctly, he said he had only seen it once. I kind of assumed that everybody had, you know, had this in their playbook, kind of as a go-to or something they had revisited. So Anthony, I think, only saw it once, might have been in high school. I'm curious to hear, he might have the most unique perspective to offer. So Anthony, take us away.
Sure thing. Thanks, Kirk. I think, first of all, we've done one other Coen Brothers movie before, right? A Serious Man Only. So I think there's a couple of different threads here. I don't know how Kirk wants to take this later on. You know, I mean, there's a question of how does this work as a Coen Brothers movie? Not in the sense of, you know, is it a Coen-y type feel or Coen brother type feel, but where do we kind of see it in terms of its filmography, which I think we talked about before, is obviously some people prefer the comedies to the dramas. Me, I've always gravitated towards the noir side of the Coen brothers, things like Miller's Crossing, their very first film. Its name's slipping my mind at the moment, but that type of thing has always been my game with them, more so than their kind of Serious Mans or their Big Lebowskis. This one, I think, is actually in many ways a kind of near perfect film in many different aspects. Even if for myself, I wouldn't put it in the top of their filmography for me personally. I still prefer something like Miller's Crossing or Fargo even. But at the same time, to get back to what Kirk was saying earlier, it's been over 10 years since I've seen this and over 10 years since I read the book. What I remember at the time was much of the dialogue being taken kind of directly, which the book itself is a kind of minimalistic, parsed down novel that kind of feels almost like a screenplay already in many ways. And what I remembered over all that time is the famous scenes, of course, the coin toss, Anton Sugar, Javier Bardem's performance as him. I completely forgot about things like Woody Harrelson as the kind of bounty hunter role, which is actually one of my favorite parts of the movie, the scene where Josh Brolin says, maybe he should be afraid of me. And it's a moment that in most films would be played as kind of the badass moment or something, kind of setting us up for a showdown or the kind of cat and mouse to be kind of caught. One thing I think the Coen brothers do really well here, it just feels so hollow. It feels like it's like ripped out and taken and kind of deconstructed in such a great way. So a lovely moment there, but so many other things I kind of forgot about. I love Woody Harrelson in that role. And I've recently rewatched the first season of True Detective. And I've come to the understanding that Woody Harrelson has a certain shtick and a certain background, a certain persona he brings as an actor. And when he gets cast right, it just works so well. And I just love that characterization of that kind of bounty hunter role. These other moments, like the Norteno, what would be a kind of a Mexican style music band coming across the one guy's body and helping him out, these kind of details of the kind of neo-Western or kind of modern Western, the touches of things that may or may not have been intended, like Javier Bardem as a Spaniard roaming across Texas, hunting things down with Mexican bodies as kind of in the landscape or built into it, has a kind of interesting colonial feel to the movie. So there's a lot of different threads to talk about, a lot of things I love. The tension that gets built up, the tension that kind of sustains itself throughout the movie for me works. And I don't know if it will for the others, but it works completely for me. I will say by the time I get to that end, and I hear this famous Tommy Lee Jones moment, which underwhelmed me in high school, works a little bit better now that I'm a little older. I'm not this kind of, teenager anymore. And I kind of get it. At the same time, it still doesn't quite hit, I think, the way critics talk about it or something. Like what I imagine, and I didn't read this, but what I imagine Ebert or someone like that probably raved and read into it. So I'll kind of leave it basic for now, because I think this is going to be more of a fun film to conversate about, to see what pieces people really responded to. But overall, I had a very positive second experience.
Thank you, Anthony. I'm happy to hear that. That's high praise for sure. I did neglect to mention this is an adaptation of the, I think, 2005 Cormac McCarthy novel of the same name. My mistake. And it's significant because this is like a quite rather literal adaptation. There isn't much that they played around with. I'm sure, you can nitpick. Obviously, a book is, contains more than a movie ever could in most cases, at least. But yeah, it's just an interesting direction that they kind of took. I think they were making another film or preparing to make another movie at the time, and they switched course. They were so drawn in by the story. Obviously, Cormac McCarthy is a paragon of the industry. And so let's head over to Mr. Connor here. Let's hear what you have to say. I'm going to get into more specific questions, but I guess if you do want some direction, perhaps you might be able to offer, some things that, some thematic elements that kind of piqued your interest or stood out to you, moments that grabbed you, etc.
Thank you, Kirk. I'm gonna, I think echo a little bit of what Anthony said. Just on that very last moment, almost the exact same story as me. I've seen this movie maybe twice, I think, but I think I remember the first time that I saw it, most distinctly, and I was probably in high school at the time, and there were aspects of it that I thought were so cool. There was this kind of badassery, right, to it that I think charmed and fascinated, a pretty wide audience at the time. But then, of course, there's that ending with the hard cut to black, right? The abrupt description of a dream, right? And what does it mean? And if you don't get it, fuck you, out the door, movie's over. There was something kind of, for someone who wasn't exposed to a lot of movies at the time, right? It was kind of provocative, interesting, but maybe not. Obviously now, and I'm just so happy, it sounds like a brag or something, but after watching a lot of movies and really tuning into the movie this time, and also, as I'll get to in a second, thinking about some of the Coen brothers' other movies, that moment lands so well for me, not necessarily for the content of the dream, because it's nice, it's this old Western image, and the father, making a fire, we all have to make a fire, in our lives, that, sure. And I think there is a cool interpretation of it, and it can be inspiring in a way. But it's just the context of everything that's happened, and that this is an old man just retired with nothing, who can't literally can't figure out what he's going to do that day, with nothing else to do but just describe his dream, to his wife, who's eager to hear it. And that moment is very magical, and I'd missed that, because I was too busy thinking about, okay, what does it all mean? So I guess that's kind of pars pro toto for the fact that I really love this movie, and I was coming in ready to critique it, ready to be maybe probably not a hard no, maybe a soft yes, in that I respect it, but I don't love it as much as Coen brothers' other movies. As Anthony mentioned, it's different, right? Because when I think of the Coen brothers, I think of A Serious Man as probably my favorite. I think of Fargo, right? And they seem to belong to a very different, tradition. They're very writerly, the Coen brothers, right? They're kind of the writers, directors, right? And their writing style is so distinct, and it's clever, and it's immediately captivating. And it's the style that, I think I would align him, right, with people who came up around the same time in the late 80s and 90s, right? Tarantino, et cetera, right? This kind of a sort of a postmodern sensibility, a lot of reference, a lot of pop cultural kind of revision and critique. And how different could this be, right, from that, right? That it doesn't have that strength. It doesn't have their ability to be playful and to reference and to remix and to do all these things. They seem to do so well. But as Anthony just mentioned, and he's reminded me, the fact that the Coen brothers are also kind of directors of noir movies as well, right? In Village Crossing, which I saw very recently. I think it's the most recent movies that I've seen by them, which was very interesting to me. It has a lot of the flashy dialogue as well. But in that case, yes, the noir is so important to them. And now, as I look back on their films, I can see that running throughout, those quiet moments of being alone and contemplating and thinking to yourself and being befuddled, right? That is something that runs throughout their films, and something they do so well in this movie. And it's, in some ways, I think it's the best version of that they've done, just simply because they're not too busy writing. They're so busy creating the images that Cormac McCarthy has given them, and creating those moments, and having, for instance, that kind of middle stretch of Llewellyn going from hotel room to hotel room is truly thrilling. I found it very I had this kind of gut feeling of dread, and they do that through the details of how is he going to make the hook to grab the suitcase, how he's sawing off the shotgun, all of these kind of very tactile details. It really is kind of one of a kind. And I think it's I guess to me, it's almost a standout. I mean, among their filmography, I would say. But I have to think about it more, yes, I guess from a point of view of personal enjoyment. I don't like it as much. I don't get it the laughs. I don't get the brain ticklings as much. But, certainly on an emotional level, it connected to me. And for reasons I'm sure we'll mention about, the feelings that Tommy Lee Jones character has too. But so I would just say that I really loved it. I have some critiques in my back pocket, but they're not very substantial, because I think this is a fine film. Fine in the positive sense.
Fine. Yeah, it's no. Thank you, Connor. And I think you've elucidated much of what I would have said too. It's, I feel like we're kindred spirits in that sense, at least on this film. And very, very eloquently said. So let's move on to Tony. Tony, why don't you give us some of your thoughts? Give us some truth bombs. Let's hear it.
Well, first of all, I thought Daniel Day-Lewis as the crazy oil prospector was an amazing touch, incredible performance. The whole "oh, I'll drink your milkshake" thing, it was great. So I like the movie. But no, I'd seen this maybe 3 times. I'd seen it like a decent amount. I have a funny story of when I first saw it. I would have been, I guess, 14, and it had just won Best Picture. And my mom, I was never allowed to watch R-rated movies. My mom's like, "I'll take you to see, No Country for Old Men." So I went with my mom and like 2 of my cousins, and she covered my eyes during the violent bit. So that was my first experience with it. And I walked out, I was like, "Yeah, I got that. That was great." Of course, I get why it won, So, and I kind of left it alone for a long time, but then I, revisited it like after college and kind of like really every viewing, I like it a little bit more. So I think this is the best viewing of No Country for Old Men I've had so far. It's hard to even know where to start. I think that the level of the filmmaking in terms of the action sequences and in terms of the kind of suspense sequences are like the best of the best. Like, this is as good as it gets. Like, to me, like the level of their filmmaking in these scenes, like the really intense scenes of this movie, is like, it should be taught in film school. They should show this in film school, which I'm sure they do. But just like the simplicity of it and the directness of it. Like when you see Chigurh in his truck driving down the road, and then you cut to the transponder on the seat next to him. It beeps once, it cuts back to him. And that's all we need to see. That's all that there's no dialogue. He doesn't say, I must be getting close to where the money is. I'd better pull over or anything like that. And having that amount of trust in the audience. I think this movie puts a lot of faith in the audience, not even just in terms of its second half, but in terms of not giving us more that we need in terms of the dialogue and in terms of the shots. It feels very spare and very minimalist. The lack of a music. I mean, I guess is there a musical score in this movie? Because it says music at the end. It says music by Carter Burwell, which I guess is just the end credits music.
If there is
Nolan-esque noise in the background.
Yeah, it's rather unremarkable or quite invisible.
But it's something you notice during some of these scenes that in any other movie would have, a backing, an intense instrumental backing. And they make, I think, the bold and correct choice to completely leave it out. And it contributes to this feeling of banal realism and dread that the movie's kind of all about. This idea that you can die for any reason at any time for just completely pointlessly. And nobody is spared, nobody is protected. And I like the way we see how the different characters kind of deal with this. You have, Josh Brolin obviously is kind of the cocky, he thinks nothing bad will ever happen to him. He's tremendously overconfident at every turn. The decision to make the money itself, of course. And at every turn, he's reassuring his wife, like, "Oh, I'm one step ahead," or, "Oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that," even though obviously he isn't. And then you have the Woody Harrelson character Anthony talked about, who kind of explains to Josh Brolin. He appears almost like an angel at his bedside and like explains to him, "This is how things are. Like, I get this. Like, you have to think about this seriously, or you have to accept your situation." But he, of course, when confronted with the same thing, just devolves into sputtering and trying to justify himself or trying to get out of the situation. So everybody in this, world the movie creates it has to face this in the same way. And I think that the tone and the atmosphere, just the dry, hot atmosphere throughout the whole movie, is just suffuses like every single scene. I think the production design and the set decoration is like some of the best I've ever seen. Every like house, just like the house at the end of the movie, every hotel room is perfect. The scene, I mean, Llewellyn dies off screen, of course, but the scene where he's just walking down the busy strip over to the motel and just seeing the background, the old fast food places and stuff, I think it's just amazing that they just transport you to this other time and place. But yeah, just like the sequences, like early in the movie when he first discovers the money, or he first discovers the drug deal gone bad in the desert, the way that that's shot and the way that that's edited, I think is remarkable. Just like he looks through the binoculars, he sees the bodies in the distance, and just like it is so economic, where it feels patient, it feels slow, but it never drags. Every shot adds new information and brings us further into this and brings him further into this situation. But yeah, but on the whole, I was very positive. The second half was always the thing in this movie that I kind of struggled with, or that is the more, like Connor said, the more provocative part of the movie, killing off your protagonist off screen in such a jarring way, in a way that is still like it still feels jarring. No matter how many times I see the movie, it's like, it's a genuinely very shocking moment, especially how late it comes in the movie. It feels, wrong in some way. But of course, watching it now, that makes so much sense, because that's the whole point, is that he's not protected. We shouldn't have assumed he was protected, right? And as for the ending, I was just listening. My goal was just like, I'm going to listen to this dream and I'm going to understand what this dream is all about. So I appreciate Connor saying that's completely beside the point. So, which I think is probably correct. That sounds compelling to me. But on the whole, I loved it, and I appreciate this as sort of an alternative voice for them, or an alternative note for them, like dialing back the humor, embracing just that atmosphere. And I think that also, I haven't read this book. I do like Cormac McCarthy, and I've not read No Country for Old Men, but I feel like they did such an amazing job translating his atmosphere and his prose to the screen in terms of the feeling you get reading Cormac McCarthy. I think they really channeled. So anyway, I hope we get the Blood Meridian movie one day. I don't know if it's ever going to happen, but they would be a contender for sure. So
thank you, Tony. Yeah, I think what you said is very true, especially, I guess I'll kind of get into my brief understanding of this film. When I first saw it, I was a little angered. I had such a prosaic understanding of how these types of movies should unfold. I thought there would be a standoff at the end between the two, and Llewellyn would come out victorious. I didn't really understand what I was getting into, much like Llewellyn didn't necessarily understand what he was getting into when he came across that crime scene. Yeah, I think what really stood out to me in the beginning is that we're set in this area. The region is very much specified through kind of the environmental storytelling. It's, quite an arid, desert, barren place with certain patches of vegetation, but we know where we are. This is, I think there's a double removal too, because this is 1980. So conventions are already a little bit archaic relative to our standards today. And then it's West Texas. So it's this double removal that's quite intriguing. It almost makes it feel extraterrestrial, in a way. I mean, it's like it's a Martian landscape, right? And so, well, with vegetation, of course. But yeah, just some random thoughts on the movie. I think for me, the biggest thing that I tried to take away from this viewing is the last 30 or so odd minutes. We know what we have in kind of the cat and mouse pursuit. It's so compelling. It's so gripping, at least in my opinion. The image of this tactical shotgun with the oversized silencer is like a very timeless image to me. While he's walking in his socks in the motel courtyard, I think their use of violence is in line with the book. From what I've heard, I haven't read the book, but it's very gripping, and the movie, like you said, Tony, it's like caked in dread. Like, we know from the beginning that this isn't good. There's really very few good outcomes. We're not going to see, who is it, Kate McDonald on in Cancun with millions of dollars. We know something bad is coming. One element that wasn't necessarily addressed but is probably implicit is the idea of their performances. I think across the board, this was so well acted. I can't really point to a bad performance, but particularly the main four characters, Kate McDonald, Javier Bardem, Josh Brolin, and Tommy Lee Jones. I'm not sure if I remember correctly. I know one of them might have won an Oscar. It might have been Javier Bardem, Best Supporting.
it was Javier Bardem.
Yeah. So I don't know if Tommy Lee Jones was nominated, but my goodness, is his performance. I mean, it just, some performances, you feel like the person was made for the role. I know, Connor, you were referencing this with like Woody Harrelson, but you can just see what you're looking for on his face. It's like, reading tea leaves, basically. The lines, they kind of cut like canyons in this landscape. But it's this old man coming to terms with the world that he can't understand anymore. And there's these elements of implicit racism, of course, xenophobia, patriarchal customs and systems, the idea of whiteness, the idea of being self-sufficient, of respecting delineation of good and bad. And then we have Anton Chigurh, who is this grenade that is thrown into this very moral and structured society or cluster of societies in West Texas. And he's just this amoral, nihilistic, hell-bent individual who really provides a nice contrast to the Tommy Lee Jones character, of course, and the supporting characters. But so I think it was rather interesting. You know, I want to get into the psychology of Chigurh. I think there's a lot there, just how he comes to terms with what he does and who he is in the world and what the world is to him. I think there's a lot on the bone there. I do want to mention the shitty CGI in the beginning with the deer. I really wish they had a chance to use real deer somehow, but it's one of those things where like movies from 20 years ago can almost feel more outdated than certain movies from like 40 years ago. It's one of those weird things, but it's just shitty CGI. The lack of music. And then one more point I wanted to add is like the action sequences, like Tony was saying. If you were to compare The Pursuit at the Eagle Inn, I think it's in Del Rio, in the middle of the night, where they're just they have ownership of this ghost town. If you were to compare the beats of that scene to, say, something in The Expendables, you really can start to understand that there are levels to this. There are levels to what these folks are doing. And that scene itself is so amazing. It really is. Anyways, I'll stop rambling for now, but let's get into some questions. You know, if anybody wants to kind of jump in, I think there's a political element here that I want to explore. You know, maybe Connor or Anthony, if you want to talk a little bit about what you think of you know, you see the two sheriffs in the diner at the end talking about, you know, these people with green hair and bones in their nose. It's a dismal tide, right? And then we have Tommy Lee Jones going to visit, who is likely his uncle, like a deputy from another county, who provides a different perspective and says, can't really chase after what you've lost because you keep losing things. And so you have to kind of put the tourniquet on it. But just the political sentiments that are evoked in this film, I'm curious if either Connor or Anthony want to talk about that. I have another question for Tony, but anybody want to jump in?
I'll jump in first real quick before I forget, which is their first movie, Blood Simple, was the one I was thinking of, and I could not think of that name until now. But second, because Tony brought up 2007, what a great year for movies. That should be addressed real quick. And then finally, it's kind of fascinating that unadjusted for inflation, this was actually the Coen brothers' second biggest hit of their career. Number one is True Grit, which is probably, I mean, I could be off, but I would guess one of the more forgotten of their films. Like, I never hear anyone bring that up, but similarly, a Western, a bit more traditional than one here. But in terms of the political resonance, Kirk, I'd say first, this is like one of the few movies I never really, after I got into it, at least in the last several years, have looked up what people really say about it. I imagine then, and I imagine recently, a lot of people probably pinpointed a certain post 9/11 paranoia to the movie. There's something kind of paralleled, right, to the idea of pursuit, the pursuit of enemies, the pursuit of agenda without regard to certain kind of fears or without regard to certain kind of emotions. A kind of world where strict rationality becomes something equivalent to a psychopath type behavior. But I think thinking about the ending scene with Tommy Lee Jones's character in our current moment, especially in a moment that has intense feelings about things like police and police brutality and police structures in the first place, there's something kind of especially resonant about the Tommy Lee Jones character discussing his dreams and the sheriff itself, you know, the idea of the title alone, the No Country for Old Men, the kind of vision of a Western that's already closed, which is so common to so many different kind of films, TV shows and video games, you know, the Red Dead Redemption motif, the Once Upon a Time in the West, all sorts of things that play with this. But the idea, of course, of something always being ready to close, or that you are no longer fit for the kind of generational feel, I think would be kind of drawn out a bit more by people today if they were to watch the movie, or at least kind of analyze it or pinpoint to a certain type of ending there. And of course, pinpointing it, since we've all seen a number of other Coen brothers films, one of the things they do, of course, is the way they treat dreams as things to almost discount and move past. It's there in Hell Caesar. It's there inside Llewyn Davis when he talks about the dream. It's always something that kind of contains everything about a person and yet can never really be fully translated to someone else. And on an individual character level, I think we kind of have to feel that by the time we get to the end of this movie. So just a few kind of scattered thoughts there, but while they were on my mind, just wanted to throw them out.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit on something, which is, it's kind of interesting how they decided how much to show. I think there's an element of like show and tell in this film, where a lot of the film is backloaded, right? A lot of the thematic content, kind of the exposition, the various reconciling and requiem for something that we don't necessarily understand. We're not meant to understand, maybe, but it's interesting because are we meant to understand these characters, or is the nature of the film supposed to be that we don't really have access into their motives? You know, it's kind of interesting when you look at Josh Brolin's character, how in the beginning, he like embodies this kind of John Wayne, mystique. And I feel like I gave him the benefit of the doubt for passing up this, opportunity to perhaps get some help, go to the police initially. Maybe he could have saved that person's life. I think they shot themselves. One of the Mexican people in the car shot himself because he was dying, and Josh Brolin was very, very lackadaisical in getting help. He was more concerned about the money. But it's interesting how I slid into that, and his motives were kind of obfuscated initially. And then we just realized he was after money and just kind of, addle-pated in a sense. He didn't really have a plan except that he knew what he wanted. But I guess I'm curious if Connor, maybe if you have anything to say about like the structure of the film, the idea of the Coen brothers kind of examining the stakes of the film. It's very heightened, but we don't really come to terms with what we've seen towards the end. We don't come to terms with the fact that this might be indicative of a societal shift, indicative of individual vanity, as Tommy Lee Jones is accused of imbuing or possessing because he wants his society to stay the same. I don't know, maybe I'm kind of rambling, but also I'm trying to get towards that idea that there are all these themes that are kind of coming together at the end of the film. And maybe whether or not you felt like that worked for you, Connor, or if you felt like, I guess we're kind of rehashing your impression of the film, but I know you were kind of a little dubious of the dream sequence, but even the coin toss with Kate McDonald, we have a bunch of things at the end that kind of come full circle. So curious what you have to say.
Well, Kirk, there's a lot. And I was also thinking about the political thing, just to address that for a second, because you brought it up. I was trying to, in my head, I was bouncing back and forth on like the question, like, is this like propaganda? And is this acceptable, that we're supposed to sympathize with this Texas lawman, right? At this time, right? But of course, this is such a tedious kind of conversation. I don't think we're going to get anywhere with that kind of back and forth. I mean, this was, I feel like the question that you prompted in me anyway. But I'm trying to get past that. And now you raise some really interesting questions about the structure and, kind of the how it comes together. I agree. If I had to comment on the structure, I would just chime in to agree with Tony on the fact that I always found it a little bit tough, a little bit difficult, this ending. His death is so unexpected. But of course, okay, this is where, all of as you said, Kirk, all of the themes are sort of exposed in that it's again and again and again, this idea of inexorable fate, right? And that comes too with the old man. I don't think we're supposed to, that old sheriff in the town where Llewellyn is killed, right? I don't think he's supposed to be taken at face value. There's something kind of pathetic and there's something so subjective, right? About that feeling that everything's gone to hell and there's no morals anymore. And that exists, right, in Tommy Lee Jones. He can't kind of escape it. Obviously, his version of it is a lot more profound because he's just witnessed what is this clear evidence of just the world gone mad and this insanity and this cruelty, which, like I think we can also relate to that, right? We've kind of seen that in our own lives, right? And, it feels no less shocking. And I guess you don't have to necessarily connect it to a sense of the past, but there is a feeling of lost innocence. There's a sense that I thought the world would make sense by now, and it doesn't. And that leads to this kind of feeling of the world upside down, the world gone wrong. That I think the sheriff kind of, encapsulates, or kind of he embodies that feeling, which again is subjective. Now compare it to here's where I was going back and forth a little bit on this, because on the one hand, the movie does seem to say, in that Tommy Lee Jones's character, this is in his mouth. He says at the very beginning of the film, in the opening monologue, he says that, back in the day, the lawmen actually didn't even carry guns. And this maybe is a kind of nostalgic vision that he has. It's contrary to the common belief. It maybe represents what he thinks the ideal of a lawman is, right? That he's someone who can deal with these things without necessarily resorting to to violence. But is he trying to imply that really the world was a lot more peaceful? Because of course we could instead say that this is no longer the Wild West and things are much more calm now. And it's actually hard to say which one is worse, right? When it's kind of frontier warfare and genocide, or probably that's worse, but anyway, or right, this kind of sense of a decaying society where violence is rampant. And but of course think too about what the old co-worker, the friend of his grandfather or father, says when he talks about how right, there was a moment too in the past where this lawman, Uncle Mac or whatever, was killed by Indians. I mean, apparently kind of unprovoked. It was kind of seen as a kind of completely unpredictable, bizarrely cruel act. Of course, probably should maybe look into that. Maybe look into maybe what the context was of that. Of course, from the modern perspective.
No, I take it as face value, Connor. That's what happened.
Yeah.
When I started watching that scene, I got angry. I started standing up. I started dancing around. So
yeah. But no, I mean, so I'm just being a little smartass, because of course we understand how that feels, how it would feel, even if there was context to that situation, right? But I guess the point of that is to say is that this is subjective, this feeling of the world gone wrong, because it's always been like this. But it's rather kind of a point in our life's journey rather than, a literal point in history, right? I guess is what I would say. And I had something else I wanted to say, but I think that was my main point. I guess this to bring up one thing would be the theme is of inexorable fate. You can't control it, right? Chigurh, even right at the end, he gets T-boned by the car. He doesn't die, which is kind of a little bit upsetting to us, right? It would have been fitting if he died, right? But he could have, right? And the point being there, I think, too, to contrast that with the fact that Kate McDonald's character, Llewellyn's wife, says to him as he's about to kill her, right, you don't have to do this, and they always say that you don't have to do this, but it's true, right? You don't have to do this. That is the point, right? We have free will. So obviously it's trying to contrast those two things. I don't know where the movie comes down. It seems to say that we have limited free will within this inexorable fate, so therefore exercise it justly. I mean, that's not exactly a groundbreaking interpretation, but I guess that's what I would say about it. I'm sure there's more interesting things to be said about it. But
Tony, you're the duck. We've sprinkled a lot of dry bread on the ground. You're here to eat up the morsels we've provided. You could go any which way.
Connor ate some morsels. It's all right. I'll probably regurgitate with some of what he said. No, but I liked the green-haired scene, or the green-haired line or whatever, which I was laughing when you were saying that, because I just imagined the Coen brothers at interviews being if you have green hair, don't come to our movie. It's disgusting. That's awful. But no, but it's funny in context actually. And there are a few moments in this movie of kind of Coen-y humor. The guy Llewellyn meets on the bridge, where the guy goes he keeps saying, "Were you in a car accident?" He kind of keeps saying it. There's the comic relief guy. That kind of feels like a Coen-y little touch. I wouldn't be surprised if that's something they added, not having read the book. But to me, that green hairline is funny because of the context, because he's just witnessed this horrible massacre, and he's having this very human reaction, which they kind of bond over. It was what the world's going to shit. How could this happen? Whatever. And then the guy's kids walking down the street with green hair, as though there's any relationship between those two things. But I like the moment too, because on the one level, it's he has a point in that he's acknowledging a genuine thing, which is like the world passing him by. He's seeing things he never thought he would see, and he's powerless to stop it, and he kind of doesn't know what to say about it, which is a real genuine reaction, right? It's funny because of the context where he would make that association, but to him, that association makes sense to him, that there is something to that. But it also shows, again, his blinkered perspective and his inability to kind of grapple with the reality of what he's dealing with. So I think it furthered the theme of different characters reacting to this fate in different ways. And regardless of your reaction, it's still going to come for you. So you could have the most profound, wise, perspective on all this, but you still, at the end of the day, sitting in the chair across from Sugar and have to make your choice. But I don't have too much to add beyond what Connor and Anthony have already given us.
Okay. Anthony, you had something quick, or it doesn't have to be quick at all. It could be 2 hours. I mean, please give us a textual reading.
My commentary track is about to start now. No, actually, I was thinking about what Connor was saying with his dreams again. And rather than the idea of lost innocence, but the idea of innocence being something that you're constantly dreaming of being lost is, I think, another kind of way to spin this. So I've always found the kind of, I've never seen such horrible things before, I can't believe it's happening, kind of ludicrous. I think it's more ludicrous when we look into the setting of the film, not just Texas. It's specifically Eagle Pass, which I don't know if anyone knows this, is actually the first foundation of American settlement along the Rio Grande. It was the major zone for fighting the Mexican-American War, but also for fighting the Apache in a number of different wars. It also became the place where they lured different illegal gunslingers to their deaths. But another famous thing about this trail, where Eagle Pass is it was one of the major routes to California and the West. So there's a whole interesting, fascinating thing about it. But underneath this all of where this town exists and where this guy's a sheriff at is a whole history of violence, bloodshed, war, colonization, frontierism, and it continues today. Recently, around the time this film was coming out and around the time Cormac McCarthy was writing this, was a whole FBI investigation about the corruption of Eagle Pass and law enforcement as it regards border security and internal security. So it's super fascinating. The film, of course, moves along the Rio Grande in different kind of ways. Of course, there are these fleeting kind of transient settings in these motel rooms, but I find there's something kind of interesting in that. And so I think there's kind of a dark Coen brothers humor at the same time when we hear this, when we think more about it, which is like, how can you dare to dream and cover up these nightmares with ideas of lost innocence? Like, how dare you? Which may be one way to kind of spin it, which also may be giving a lot of credit to it.
No, I think for sure. I don't think it's lost on them, though. I wish it were addressed more. I think there are very tiny elements, like Tommy Lee Jones. He asks the little girl to call the police, and then he says in Spanish. I think there's little nods to the idea of this kind of this humanity that would be too terrifying to acknowledge. We want to pretend almost like there's an ocean to the south because we want to be separatists, right? At least nowadays, and for sure, that continues. You even see videos on Twitter and all that of like, these convoys are coming to get us and all. And so, but there's a political dialogue that I think could have been explored a little bit more explicitly, but it's hard to say. I mean, it's the idea, it's a movie centered in kind of whiteness and white understanding of these areas of the country, right? It's frontierism, like you said. I wanted to turn a little bit to the idea of fate, because I think this is the ultimate through line. This is the kind of the 1A theme for the film. We start with the fate encounter that Llewellyn stumbles across this mass killing. We end with, like one of you said, Tony or Connor, with the fate, kind of the chance car crash that almost kills Shigur. And then Shigur uses coins. And so these coins are these, I don't know how you would describe them, these artifacts that serve to inform his actions, right? And I'm wondering where do we come down on Shigur? Is he full of shit? and he just wants to scapegoat fate for his actions. He's basically so far gone that the only ego defense he has is to say that fate has, makes me do these things. Like, but at the same time, it seems as if, there's this randomness that pervades the whole film. So it is like a little of one, some of the other. But I'm just curious, we talk about the coin tosses, right? And I think at the end he says, well, this coin got here the same as I did. So it's almost like he's saying that the coin led him. He's saying, who's to know what, who is in control of anything? But are we denying his agency in the situation? Like as he was indicted by Kate McDonald's character, it's just you. It's not fate. It is just you. And do we buy that? Where do we come down on that, on Shigura's character? And I guess the final little appendage there would be, does this speak to how we understand good and evil in a societal sense? I always like to tie back to the systems involved, right? And so like seeing fate and these rolling tides, like you said, kind of this inexorable fate. How do we understand that? What does it mean for us? Does it mean we're, we could really, really jump to far off places, talk about Bitter Lake, talk about all these things. But anyways, anybody wants to jump in?
I'm just curious to mention one thing about Sugar that I just find interesting. I don't really know how to reconcile those two things, those two grand themes. Obviously, in that scene, the wife character is begging him, right, that he does have the choice. Clearly, he does as well. The coin got here, same as me. The point is to say that somehow he was not in control of how he wound up in the situation. Now, it's funny that, right, he's the character for whom that is in some ways the least true, because he's the character who is the least accountable to any other force. Whereas the others, as Woody Harrelson's character points out, follow the money or follow their self-interest in a way that is predictable. And in some ways, it's something that they can't avoid, right? Following their own self-interest. Shigura is the one who acts almost completely arbitrarily. And he almost is, what's interesting to me too, is that he has this almost kind of artistic, kind of thrill-seeking, bohemian, kind of logic to him. I was just reading like On the Road, I think of the characters in On the Road who are always looking for thrills and do kind of these unpredictable, often immoral things, and I find that Shigura, I think Cormac McCarthy is kind of calling back to those characters, that are kind of classic American characters. And having this character who, for instance, like think of the moment where he shoots at that random crow and misses. Or my favorite one that I noticed this time, they set this up so nice. It's a subtle little thing where when he winds up in the motel, when Llewellyn enters the Eagle Pass motel, there's a cat that's drinking milk. And when he comes back through the door next door, we see that Shigura has broken in. He's killed the motel owner, and he's knocked over the cat's milk. That kind of like detail, right? That he lives for this kind of chaos. Obviously, the fact that it's such a small detail is what makes it so powerful. But he lives for these kind of thrills, and he seems to have the power to actually be motivated by more than money, which makes him an interesting character. I guess he's in some ways, is he the one who's supposed to show us that it is possible to avoid inexorable fate? Or it's also, but in some ways he's contrasted with the other characters who seem to obey not fate per se, but the basic laws of probability and self-interest, which lead us obviously, to all kinds of issues in the real world. I think you can trace a lot of issues in the real world too, right? Competing self-interest, right? People just acting to save their own skins, right? And abetting evil in that way and that kind of thing, which is another kind of cruel fate, right? So, I don't know where to come down on that, but I just wanted to mention the cat milk thing.
Tony, does it matter? Does this matter ultimately, or is this movie good enough where we don't even have to dig this deep?
No, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, it's a kind of a fundamental question because Shigura is such an important character and such a powerful force in the movie. I mean, I've always viewed him as being like a supernatural force, is like the agent of fate. And I think it's a little bit ambiguous. I mean, you do see him get injured. You see allusions to his mortality. And, again, he like misses the crow, for example, the fact that he does get in the car accident. But I would contend that the car accident reinforces this, because to me, like, he could not die. Nothing. He would just change forms. And in this world, Shigur is still around in 2020. He just looks different. He has a different identity. He's like Randall Flagg in the Dark Tower for Anthony. Anyone else out there likes that. But yeah, so that's how I've always viewed Shigur, because I think if he is human, it definitely that's why I'm kind of sidestepping that question, because as soon as you accept that he's human and he's enthralled to these forces himself, I think it gets a lot messier. But it's interesting. I think the Coens want to kind of tease us or make us ask that question, even if they don't have a definitive answer.
And then I guess it might be fun to kind of, as we think about wrapping up, but I'm certainly open to going anywhere anybody wants to. But in terms of the emotional valence of this film, what it would leave you with, I think the emotions sometimes are the first things to come and the last things to leave when we're considering a film, especially, rather great films. Like, I think this one, as objectively as we can view it, I think we could say this is a good film. But what will stick with you when somebody, 10, 20 years from now mentions this film? I know it's already 15 years old, but what kind of will stay with you in your gut? Connor, you mentioned your gut, right? Anybody want to jump in? I'm curious to hear.
The scene they always associate with this movie is the hotel with Llewellyn on his bed in the dark. He's got his gun propped up and he's looking under the door. That to me, that whole sequence, and you've mentioned it a couple of times, that's one of my favorite sequences in like any movie ever. I think it's absolutely masterful. So just the start of that sequence and that unbearable tension, everything from when he comes into the hotel, is what I think of when I think of No Country for Old Men.
That's a great moment, Tony. But I'm curious, Anthony, I'm actually curious on your answer on this one. Like, you said some elements were hollow, but it felt like in an intended way. Like, I'm forgetting which moment you were referencing when in your opening thoughts, but you said the ending might have felt a little more impactful for you, a little more salient in terms of maybe the dream interpretation or the. Let's hear what you thought.
Well, I think that the dream thing, when I first saw it as a teenager, kind of went over my head in the sense of like it was something you didn't necessarily want to deal with. It was kind of the reaction of like that was it type moment. Whereas now, trying to watch it, I certainly was trying to think about the Freudian interpretive element of those two stories. But hearing Connor talk about them, I think, is a much more interesting prompt, getting me to think about the way they kind of are used as excuses, that they could kind of be a certain hollow, even if they are representative of who someone really is. What does someone dream about? And how does that kind of relate to them as a kind of an interesting standard psychology question. But getting back to the scene that I was thinking about, and I was mentioning at the very beginning, was the Woody Harrelson bounty hunter scene. His name's slipping my mind, or his character's slipping my mind. But Carson. The way he's Yes, Carson. The way he's introduced almost feels kind of like a Mulholland Drive cowboy moment, if you remember that moment. But for him to die, after 10 minutes of screen time, very shortly after, feels like the kind of Coen brothers joke, even if it comes from the novel. It's the type of thing they love to do, to pull the rug out, to have this character who, in a conventional movie, would be the badass or would be a kind of another anti-hero for us to kind of ponder over, is instead given a kind of short shrift, a kind of play on not just the Western, but that noir sort of bounty hunter, gun for hire, whatever you want to call it. That was the kind of resonant moment with me.
Yeah, kind of like all your heroes are dead type of thing.
Yeah.
I like that those two scenes feel so out of place. I would say they're probably both in Dallas, right? Like, it would make sense, but you see the elevator going up, and then you have this sheepish kind of effeminate guy who's like, I'm in accounting, and he's like, you're not going to shoot me, are you? And he says, it depends. Do you see me? And that was kind of a laugh out loud moment for me, just because of how Shigur relates to the world. Like, he has this rather carefree element or kind of attitude that's a little bit, it cuts. It's a little dry. Anyways, Connor, did you have like a most salient moment or scene that you wanted to share before we go to voting?
Well, that would have to be lay epic. Call it Friendo. No, I didn't love that scene as much. I don't like Friendo. Like it doesn't. I don't buy it as something you would say. Anyway, but no, there's a moment that stands out to me that encapsulates one of the feelings this movie brings out. Llewellyn stumbles upon the car with the Mexican guy, the cartel member or whatever, still, bleeding but alive. He cries out, for water. Ain't got no water. And then as Llewellyn is walking away, he says, like, there are wolves. And he's like, ain't no lobos. And just leaves the door open. That kind of thing, that the horror of that, someone just wanting this last comfort, either of water or of just being protected from the wolves that are outside, this almost childlike feeling. It's so sad. Of course, we hear wolves howling when he's in Mexico, right? So it's kind of like, maybe he doesn't know, he thinks they're wolves, but, and I guess the point is to say, yes, there are wolves, practically speaking. And that maybe he's not so wrong to seek comfort in that moment, and probably it shouldn't be denied him either. But it is interesting, of course, powerfully human Llewellyn thinks of that in the middle of the night, much, much later, to bring the water back, which was what really gets him in trouble too. But
thank you all very much for your thoughts. For me, it's a pleasure to have watched this film. Anyways, I shouldn't get ahead of myself, because who knows whether it will enter our canon. We do have some votes to make. So whoever would like to go, please feel free. And we'll take it from there. I guess we'll go in the order we started. So Anthony, if you'd like to go, then Connor, then Tony.
Sure. I'll quickly sum up and say that it's a definite yes for me, even if it's a middle list in the Coen brothers filmography. I'm sure Connor has other favorites from what he said. I think everything in this movie just works, for me personally, at least. I mean, there are moments that definitely don't hit maybe as hard as they should or as hard as they could. There are things that I do, somewhat agree with Connor when I say, like, would this character really do this? Or do I buy that this character would do this? Sure. At the same time, like, whether you want to give it a political, social, historical reading, or you want to view it as kind of the closed, airtight thriller, with a bit smarter than or more literary than your kind of contemporaries, I think it just works, like, overall. And I find it like just a very solid movie. Like, every element just from point A to point B, it just kind of astounds me of how easy it seems like the Coen brothers can transition from genre to genre or film to film like this. So yeah, easy yes.
Thank you, Anthony. Connor, please edify us.
Kirk, just parting shots here. A couple gripes. Friendo, I guess, would be one. CGI deer, you mentioned it. I guess it's an antelope or I don't know what it is. Anyway, it's kind of like a deer. That was one, I guess. Kate McDonald's character with Llewellyn, that kind of thing. Some characters are so broad as to be a little bit like over the top, but it does kind of work in the movie. And my eyebrows were raised at one point, but then it's like, it kind of works, right? Kind of leaning into the accents and the sounds of English as it's spoken in this region and stuff, even if it's bordering on, kind of too broad. I thought it had a point to it. So that's not really knocking against. And finally, Kirk, the title's all wrong. It should be called Yes Country for Young Men. It's in.
There we go. So Tony, is it going to be a clean sweep? What are your thoughts?
I mean, honestly, this movie kind of sucked. I don't really get why people like it, so I'm gonna have to go no. But now that I think about it, it's got to be a yes. This is the Kirk vote. No, but this is definitely a yes. This is a definite yes for me. And to me, like, I think it's even more powerful having watched more of the Coen brothers movies and just to see, like, the way they can adapt something so successfully. Again, not having read the book, but just the tone, the command of every aspect of the filming. The Roger Deakins, probably the greatest cinematographer ever. This is like just masterclass stuff. Just the shot of the motel at night and the sunset with the neon, and just the silhouettes on the cliff with the car. Just like, this is just the top tier, top level stuff. Some of the best to ever do it, the Coens and Deakins. So And this movie is fantastic. It's a must watch if anyone's has somehow not seen it. So I'm going to say yes.
All right, clean sweep. Yeah, one of the things I really love about the Coen brothers is you feel like you're talking with them. Like they're very considerate of their audience and like how you're going to view it. So anyways, I think one of you had mentioned that earlier too, but that ongoing dialogue. Okay, now we transition to the nomination phase of this episode. So the show must go on. We must analyze and critique a new film. If anybody does remember who the last person to have a film chosen was, because they will be deciding the order of nominations. We have very, very strict procedures around here at the 706. Does anybody remember perchance?
I think it was me. I think I was least recent because I think Tony picked Kagamusha.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. There we go, Anthony. What's the order?
All right. So I'm going to have Connor go last. And I think I'm going to do something. Yeah, I think I'll go first, actually, since we're claiming decades still. And I'm going to go first because I had a struggle throughout this episode of which movie to nominate to you, Kirk. I didn't know if I wanted to go studio fair, audience friendly, pop crowd pleaser, foreign language film, Anthony type of film. I'm all over the place, but I'm going to go with one that's close to the heart. And I know it's one I think Connor has seen. It's one of the sultriest movies I've ever seen. It's also one of the funniest movies I've ever seen, but it's older. It's from the 40s. It stars Barbara Stanwyck and a very handsome Henry Fonda. It's called The Lady Eve from 1941 exact. And it's a film in which Barbara Stanwyck's character poses as a woman in an effort to seduce, marry, and rob a man very innocently played by Henry Fonda, and is one of the funniest movies I've ever seen. And I'm not just saying that. It is really hilarious. It is a bit different. I don't think we've quite done a screwball comedy here. We haven't done a comedy in a while, and this may not be the type of comedy we think about, but it's worth a watch, and I'll get into more arguments for it later on.
All right, that sounds great. Who was Tony next?
What decade did you claim again, Anthony? It's not going to be one of mine. I just like to know for.
Oh yeah,
it wasn't. What?
It's the 1940s.
Okay, I didn't have it. Don't worry.
One of our game show rules: we once a decade is claimed, it's off the board. So I know Tony. He had like 6 films in the 40s, post-war 40s. He was about to nominate.
It was all movies in the 40s, my entire list. So now I'm actually kind of at a loss. That's the only good decade for cinema. It was just the 40s, and then No Country for Old Men was good, and then it was back to bad. Okay. I'm between two. And I think I'm going to do a thing. This may be cheating a little bit, but I'll ask Kirk, do you want do you want a nice little truffle? Or no, okay, I won't do this. I'll just pick one. All right. I'm going to go.
Come on. Like a pig, he wants a truffle. Come on.
I meant not Starbucks, a Godiva truffle, like the chocolate treat. Not a. Do you want a weird stinky mushroom that's very expensive for some reason? All right, I'm gonna go with a dark comedy from 2009, starring Seth Rogen, called Observe and Report. This is in the kind of the world's greatest dad vein of Tony movie, but this is I think a really. It occupies a little niche of sort of like with like super of like kind of the darkly comedic kind of Taxi Driver homage thing. I mean, maybe it's just this and Super, but I can think of a few other movies that are kind of in this vein from around this time. Dark Horse, which I pitched before, kind of has some similar vibes. Kind of a man-child, but like the dark side of the man-child archetype. And have you guys seen this one? Any of you seen this? Okay, so just Connor. So since you two haven't seen it, I think it's worth seeing. But it's basically Paul Blart Mall Cop. He's a mall security guard, but it's the dark version of it, the dark and edgy version of Paul Blart Mall Cop. So do with that what you will. But that's my pick. And it's 2000s.
Right. 2000s. Okay, Connor.
Kirk, the 40s are a great decade, but we're taking it a little further back. Talking 1926 silent film, Harold Lloyd, Girl Shy. Okay, if you're ever going to watch a silent film, if I can get you watch one silent movie, this is going to be the one, because you're going to enjoy it on so many levels. It's, as I've said before, I read you the poster from when I was recommending it for another episode. It's full of Lloyd laughs, whatever that means, but it is. And it is a fascinating time capsule in that it establishes kind of the formula for a romantic comedy. And it's a great romantic comedy. It's a touching romantic comedy that still holds up. And it is full of silent film antics. It is fascinating, too, from a historical perspective. There's interesting reflections on dating, even, that might kind of have interesting parallels to today. It's a fascinating movie, and I think you'll be surprised by how fresh a movie from then can feel. And this is a movie that I think is uniquely placed to be interesting for all of us, and then we'll all get a kick out of. And it will fulfill my dream of getting a silent movie in the 706.
All right. Well, thank you all. I just want to add some like status checks, in terms of where my head is at. So for Anthony, I'm curious, the comedy, are there other elements to it? Is this kind of like, like you said, a screwball comedy? Is there an emotional element to it? For Tony, I kind of became fatigued with Seth Rogen in the late 2000s. I'm curious, is this more of the like stoner jokes, or is it actually, does it fly in the face of that type of, it sounds like it might be a little tragic with just, I don't know, maybe being a mall cop, I guess, could be a very great job, but it sounds like there's a tinge of sadness. And then Connor, would there be enough for us to talk about for a whole episode of this silent film? So I guess that's where I'm at. I'm curious to hear, Anthony, I think you're first.
Yeah, I got to ask though first, Kirk. Is Seth Rogen in like a Jonah Hill level territory for you? Like I could see it, but like
he's not as self-serious as Jonah Hill. So he's kind of evaded that. Like I haven't red flagged him yet. So
okay. So Connor, you've seen The Lady Eve, right? I don't just misremember that. Okay, so have you seen it, Tony? So not only is this like directed by Preston Sturges, one of the great screwball comedy masters, known for his satire, there's obvious gender lines, gender things to look into, but I think the movie does a much better job of using humor in a way to dissect just men and women in general, men and women, and the way they talk, the way they behave, the way sex isn't necessarily the thing always on the mind, yet pulling, ready to come to the surface. I think there's much more there than this kind of lighthearted 40s comedy that you may think it sounds like. It is a very interesting film, and it's amazing how it gets past the code at the time. I think Connor would agree. I'd hope he'd agree. It also features Barbara Stanwyck in one of her juiciest roles. I think that's like undeniable, more than Double Indemnity for sure. So I think there's something there. Tony's film, never seen. I do know Ray Liotta's in it, so rest in peace. Maybe it's worth giving Tony another kind of dark comedy shot. It's been a while, I think. Connor's film is interesting. I love the idea of doing a silent comedy. Girl Shy, though, is sort of the Joe Rogan friendly men's, comedy, men's silent comedy. But I love me some Harold Lloyd. So the only thing I have against that film is that I would be the one, or I would prefer myself to be the one to lead a silent film episode, very selfishly. But it's a cool choice, and very excited if we do that. So I like how we presented different types of films for Kirk to pick.
Tony, last thoughts?
Yeah, so I have not seen Anthony's. I know it's something of a classic. I gotta see it. I do remember Connor's enthusiasm for Girl Shy from last time, but let me see if I got this straight. Connor, your movie's a silent movie? Like, how do you know what they're saying? I don't like it. I don't like the sound of that. Silent movie in the canon, Over My Dead Body. As for Lady Eve, that sounds fine. Observe and Report, I would say it's not your typical Seth Rogen comedy. It's kind of, he's not playing his typical kind of character. He's playing a very unlikable character. Or he becomes progressively unlikable as the movie goes on, I would say. And I guess my argument for it is I think it's sort of I feel like it's a resonant movie in a number of ways. And I think it's a good insight into like a kind of like a desire for like masculinity on the part of like a certain kind of guy in our society, the guy who really fetishizes like strength and projecting strength and being part of a brotherhood, being part of a code. the people who like really look up to cops and have the Punisher background on their phone or whatever. He's like a pathetic character, but also a character with potential for violence as well, which is kind of what the movie's all about. Like, as ridiculous as this character is. So I think it's a movie that's certainly like relevant and certainly like interesting. And I think we can enjoy it not just on that level, but on the level of the storytelling and the jokes as well. So that would be my pitch for it.
All right. And then Connor, I'm starting to get a little more confused here as where I stand, because these are some good rebuttals, but Connor, go ahead.
So I have nothing bad to say about The Lady Eve. That's a great, great movie. And I agree that it's a better role for Barbara Stanwyck. Maybe Ball of Fire is my all-time fave, but that might be number 2. And Stanwyck roles, it was a very good choice. So I'm trying to steer you, Kirk. I'm not sure what is the Scylla and what is the Charybdis, but I'm trying to steer you into something. I guess Seth Rogen can be the other side of the strait. You'll have to be led with no other choice but to pick my movie. And as to the Seth Rogen movie, I would say I've seen it. I mean, it's very interesting. I would say it's more of a but then he cries kind of movie. I would say it's that. Not really. He doesn't actually. I'm not sure if he cries or not. But it's very interesting too, the way it fits into that era when Seth Rogen was king of the heap in comedy. But okay, I'm going to pull out all the stops. Basically, my movie is about a 1920s incel who writes like a pickup artist manual and the sort of fallout from that. And we will see scenes where he tries to illustrate how he's made his various conquests. It's very funny and very interesting and kind of absurd, but still with kernels of consistency, kernels of connection, right, to the present in a way that makes us think differently about the present, in a way that can illumine things and illumine the past as well. So I think it could be very interesting. I think we'd get a kick out of it. Silent movies, a lot of times it's work to pay attention and to be invested in it. But I think this one, it'll keep your attention and you'll be glad you watched it, because it's an interesting experience to get, a different kind of filmmaking.
All right. Thank you, Connor. And I must say, I love the constant placating and like being able to hear what you guys think of my style and my preferences based on what you choose to emphasize. It's very cool, because you're pretty much spot on. And that would likely happen, though. I think, I'm a little more on the cuff in terms of my proclivities than you three are. But let's see. Observe and report. Yeah, I did have that association with Paul Blart forever, and maybe I shouldn't. And yeah, Seth Rogen, I saw like Green Hornet. I felt like that was a sideways venture, sideways move. So he does have something there. 50-50 was good in my opinion for that. A little more depth. Anthony's film, I think the 40s are such like fruitful decade for these kind of exchange of ideas and just how the world's shifting. And then Connor, your choice, silent movie, right? Like, if you were to ask me 10 years ago if I wanted to watch a silent movie, I mean, it'd be akin to like asking me to eat vegetables or, like as a kid, like my inner kid, right? I want to watch explosions. I want to see boobies. I want to watch Scarface and listen to Push It to the Limit, right? But we've all matured. Is this country for old men? I don't know. Is speaking allowed in this country? We're not sure. It might be a silent country. I think I'm going to have to choose. In the moment, I would say I will probably never have the motivation to watch another silent film in quite some time. So I guess I'll choose Connor's. He's very daring, and I can't wait to see how this unfolds. This is going to be exciting. I've never seen a silent film. I'm rather unversed. So, well, actually, that's untrue. I played Red Dead Redemption 2. I watched those films in the movie theater. So I'm an expert. Anyways, Connor, congratulations to you, Anthony and Tony. Valiant effort, good picks. I think Connor had the novelty aspect, but the other two sounded like great picks as well. So, Connor, what do you have to say for yourself?
I'm absolutely stoked we can have a silent movie on the podcast. And best of all, it's free on YouTube with soundtrack. I'm not sure if it's period or not, but you don't need it. That's the beauty of it. And I think we're all going to enjoy it. I think we're all going to have a fun time watching it.
I'll have what she's having.